Hi guys, thanks for the waiting. Well, this is part 6 of What If Kamen Rider Para DX was in RWBY. So let's start. Chapter 9, Medical Emergency. Third person POV dash. Yang could see the shock on the dichromatic boy's face as Blake had told him that he was an Amphitheater and knew full well there was something wrong. What's more, she could almost feel the shock as if it were her own, but pushed it aside thinking that it was the shock of seeing the young man trying to cut off a part of his body. She had to draw the line and tell him what a mistake he was making. Too bad it turned out to be too blunt even for her. You weren't about to cut off hair. You were about to cut off your antennae. She practically cried out. His shock reached its peak before his eyes rolled upward as he fell onto the floor limp and nearly lifeless. The only signs of life coming off him was the slow rising and falling of his chest. Dichro! Both girls yelled out as they ran to the boy's body, Blake out of shock and Yang out of fear when the feeling of shock vanished and was replaced with what she felt was a void, as if something had been ripped out of her. Blake had already begun to check for a pulse before trying to shake him awake as she pulled him to a sitting position. Weiss had ran over just before Yang had spoken up, trying to see what all the commotion was for just a little haircut, only to see the end results of an unconscious boy. The heiress was trying to see what was wrong when RWBY came running into the room. Until that point, she had been speaking with John and Pira about trying to find a suitable place for Dichro to sleep when she suddenly heard her sister cry out that very name. When she saw the unconscious boy, her immediate question was, what happened? Yang was too distracted by what she was experiencing to explain as she stumbled on her words. Noticing this, her partner answered for her, we found out Dichro was trying to cut off his antennae and tried to stop him, but he legitimately believed that he was human from what his reactions were telling us. Once Yang let slip what he was about to do, he fainted on the spot. I'd faint, too, if I were told I was about to cut off the equivalent of a nose or an eye, coined the heiress as she looked at the scene before her. Blake and RWBY glared at her in a cross between annoyance and anger before she held her hands up in defense and said, what? I'm being honest here. Doesn't matter, RWBY started, we have to do something to help. I'll try to find a professor that can help hold Blake, you and Yang take Dichro to the infirmary. Weiss, you tell Team JNPR what happened. At hearing what RWBY had planned, Yang immediately snapped out of her trance and looked her baby sister in the eye. RWBY, I'm not so sure him going to the infirmary is a good idea, she said as she turned back to the unconscious boy. Remember what happened yesterday when we tried to get him there? We don't have much of a choice, RWBY interjected. We can't just leave him there like this. Fine, but I'm not letting him out of my sight. Nodding at her sister's words, RWBY proceeded to take out her scroll and tried to call one of the teachers as Yang scooped up Dichro in her arms and tried to calmly walk out the door. What ended up happening was her going out of the door in a jog with her partner right behind her and RWBY's own partner knocking on the door of Team JNPR's room as well. Whether she liked it or not, Dichro was still both teams' leaders and, as such, had to take RWBY's suggestions seriously. As this happened, the Reaper girl managed to contact one of the professors. The image of a portly, middle-aged man with gray hair and a rather large gray mustache appeared as a deep voice replied, my word. Hello? Is something the matter? Yes, Professor, RWBY immediately answered. We have someone on his way to the infirmary right now. He suddenly fainted, and my sister is carrying him there now. She looked out the door before continuing. I don't know what exactly happened, sir, but there might be something wrong. Yes, well. This is Ms. Rose, correct? The man inquired. As soon as she confirmed it was her, he continued, then fear not, Ms. Rose, I'll let Professor Ashband know what's going on. With that, the line went dead with a click as the man hung up in a hurry. RWBY, now finished with her objective, made a beeline for the infirmary to try and follow her sister and Blake. Meanwhile, John and Pira were staring at the door, where RWBY had ran out after hearing a cry of some kind, wondering just what was going on. Ran was trying to keep his longtime friend from invading the other room when the Schnee heiress herself came up to them. Seeing Weiss, of all people, enter their room was a shock to the members of Team JNPR. They didn't think she would have a reason to be in there, yet she was about to give them one regardless. Hey, what's going on? John asked as she came in. Her reply came after she slipped a small glare at the blonde boy. Something happened with Dichro. She began to explain, initially annoyed, but as she spoke her concern grew. I'm not sure what, but, if I had to guess, it would seem our so-called leader nearly did something that would have harmed himself. Very badly, I might add. When asked what that was by the pink-loving hammer wielder, Weiss simply said, he tried to cut off his antennae. What? Was the collective response of Team JNPR. I don't understand. Pyrrha in her unnerved confusion stated. Turns out. He's an Ant Faunus, the heiress answered before continuing. Why he didn't tell us is more than likely the same reason he tried to cut his antennae. If what Blake said is true, he actually didn't know. This was when John interjected as he waved his arms out in front of him in a stopping motion and said, Whoa, wait, time out. Are you saying he didn't know he was a Faunus? How does that even happen? If I had to guess, it must have something to do with his upbringing. Ren speculated as his hand went to his chin with his index and thumb around it. Maybe Faunus are that frowned upon in his society that even recognizing them was effectively breaking some form of social law? Nora joined in the conversation at this point by practically shouting, or maybe they never even heard of Faunus where he's from. That's impossible, you'd have to meet at least one Faunus in your lifetime, Weiss interjected, but was soon rebutted by Ren. That only applies within the Four Kingdoms, Weiss, who knows what goes on outside them? Maybe Faunus don't exist, or maybe Faunus are so integrated into their society that people don't even recognize them without the obvious features? Or perhaps they have stricter standards of what consists of a Faunus? Look at Dicro, did anyone here think he was one at first glance? Pyrrha added as she looked at the room's occupants, all of which shook their heads in a negative save for Weiss. While I didn't really consider him being a Faunus at first. You weren't on the bullhead with my team and him when he showed off one of his species' telltale signs, his strength. The snow-haired girl said, he bent the armrest of a solid metal seat and he didn't even have his aura activated until earlier today. Team JNPR simply stared at her in shock. Each of them thought about different things, Nora concerned about Yang, Pyrrha concerned for Team RWBY as a whole, Ren in bemusement as he tried to put the pieces together, and John simply trying to keep track of everything, as they looked at each other before John finally spoke up, listen, we need to be sure about this, so I suggest we go on down there ourselves and find out from the horse's mouth, so to speak. I already planned on that after I told you about what happened, Weiss stated before she turned to leave. This resulted in the rest of Team JNPR following her as they silently agreed that answers were necessary. Later dash. At the infirmary dash. Dicro's unconscious form rested upon one of the divided beds with Blake and Ruby sitting on either side of him, staring at a rather peculiar sight. Just beyond the foot of the bed, pacing back and forth in inapt worry, was Yang. As she paced back and forth between the dividers surrounding the space's occupant, multiple emotions were going through her head, the least of which were anxiety, fear, confusion, and frustration. The thoughts of this morning combined with the events that just transpired had her brain going into full steam ahead as she tried to sort out what was going on. Ruby, in fear of her sister pushing herself too far, tried to speak up, Yang, please. You need to calm down and rest, all this pacing isn't doing any good for anyone, least of all Dicro. Calm down? Yang repeated in frustration before turning on her own sister, Ruby, I can't calm down. Ever since this morning, weird things have been happening to me. First, when I unlocked his aura, there was this like string thing coming out of our chests before it vanished, then whenever he got called short or something, I could feel how embarrassed or angry he was. This had both girls wide-eyed in shock, but for different reasons, Ruby in awe that her sister had unlocked his aura and Blake in horror due to knowing what was causing that. Before either girl could request it, Yang was already continuing her tirade, then we find out Dicro was trying to cut his antennae after we figured out he was an Ant Faunus, and when we tell him, he faints. And when he does, I felt like a piece of you was ripped out of your very soul, Miss Xiaolong? A fourth voice interrupted her. All three girls jumped at the voice, though visibly relaxed when they saw it was Ashbin, holding a mug of coffee in one hand and his cane in the other. Yang was the first to speak up as she asked, Professor Ashbin? What brings you down here? I heard about what happened with Dicro from Professor Port, said the headmaster as he paused to sip some of his caffeine-heavy beverage before continuing. Also, before you ask, I was here when you so politely told your sister that you can't calm down. Normally, I would have reprimanded you on your behavior, but due to the condition you are in, I am more than willing to turn a blind eye to you in this case. Condition? Ruby and Yang both repeated before the Red Cape Reaper went wide-eyed in shock. She turned her sights on Yang in a glare before asking, Yang, are you pregnant or something? Sputtering over her words, Yang looked at her sister in shock before yelling, Ruby, why would you ask that? Poor Blake couldn't handle it as she was barely holding back her giggles at her partner's distress. Sorry, sis, that was the first thing that hit my mind, was Ruby's reply before the headmaster immediately cleared his throat loudly to catch the attention of the young girls before he spoke. While that is not the condition that I was referring to, he began with his face still ever so stoic, but underneath he was grinning at the sight of at least 3 members of Team RWBY getting along, as he continued to explain, what Yang currently has can potentially lead to a similar result should both parties allow for it. As the sisters looked at Ashvin in confusion, Blake looked down in embarrassment as she could have avoided all this if she had just opened her mouth sooner. When asked what he meant by Yang, the headmaster replied, why, the fact that you have a soul bond of course. I have a what? Yang asked, utterly confounded by what he just said. His eyebrow quirked upwards as he looked at her and asked, you've never heard of a soul bond before? The only reply he got from Yang was a negative shake of her head, which Ruby clarified by saying, sorry, Professor, but Dad didn't really explain all of this when he and Uncle Crow explained Aura to us before attending Signal. The headmaster nodded in understanding as he looked to Yang and began his exposition. To begin with, a soul bond is a rare phenomenon that happens when a person's aura is unlocked through the now commonplace ritual. When this occurs, a single thread materializes between the affected parties, connecting to their chests. The effects brought on by this bond varies depending on the color of the thread. To current experts' knowledge, there are 4 colors: pink, red, green, and gold. A pink thread represents familial relations, is the most common form of soul bond, and will only form if the bondmates are family, most commonly directly. This bond allows relatives to find one another easier and allows for simpler interpretations of one another's feelings. A red thread represents rivalry, is rarer than the pink bond, and only forms between people with competitive personalities. This bond allows for the overall power that one learns to increase quite immensely until they catch up with their bondmate or rival. A green thread represents unparalleled friendship and is the second most rare type of bond, despite the only condition being that those with this bond share no form of familial relations. This means to this day no family members have achieved a green bond. This bond allows for the passive and active ability to read one another's minds, allowing for communication even across vast distances. All of these bonds, however, share a downside. Should one of the bondmates die, it will leave a void in the soul of the surviving bondmate. They never are quite themselves again, but they have not shown any suicidal tendencies. Ruby listened on with rapt attention as Ashvin spoke while Blake simply looked at him in disbelief. She hadn't realized other forms of soulmates existed before now and only knew about the golden bond. Yang, meanwhile, stared in shock before she realized that he only mentioned 3 bonds just now. As she caught on to this, she inhaled before asking, Professor, you only mentioned 3 bonds. What does the 4th one mean? Smiling softly in understanding, Ashvin nodded before answering her question. Yes, the golden bond and the rarest bond of all. This kind of bond can, quite literally, happen to anyone, yet is so rare that only one set of bondmates from each kingdom at any time has been recorded at any given time. Anyone with this type of bond are typically called golden couples for a reason. While it was not often to happen, gold bonds tend to lead to easier dating and possibly even marriage by allowing their bondmates to feel more at home and comfortable with one another. The bond itself actually gives the ability for the bondmates to feel each other's emotions and, like the pink bond, allow them to find each other no matter where they are. After taking a sip of his coffee, his face returned to being stoic as he spoke again. There is, however, a much greater drawback to this bond than any other. When one bondmate is unconscious, not asleep, the other experiences what the other types of bonds suffer should their bondmates die. If a golden bondmate dies, however, the survivor's soul will effectively be destroyed, leaving them as nothing more than a shell of their former selves, incapable of feeling any emotion whatsoever. When he finished this, all three girls paled in horror at the thought of no longer being able to feel any kind of emotion at all, though Yang's mind quickly went from herself being doomed to such a fate to the unconscious boy potentially succumbing to such a consequence. The thought itself felt heavier and more dire than if it was her suffering it. The headmaster's voice brought her attention back to the topic at hand as he spoke once more. The pink and green bonds can be cut at any time by either bondmate but can never be reformed ever again. Doing so will reduce the consequence of a bondmate dying, though it applies the portion that is left over immediately after being cut. The red bond is the only bond that cannot be cut by either bondmate, and the gold bond can only be cut by the bondmate that had their aura unlocked during the bond's formation. That being said, it is also the only bond that can reform at any given time with the aid of patience and constant contact with their bondmates. When a golden bond is cut, both bondmates will respond as if the other had died. That gave the blonde brawler some relief as she sighed. Then, I'm assuming you know which one I got, right? She asked the headmaster, who nodded. Ruby immediately jumped up from her seat and briskly walked up to her sister. Yang, what's going on? When did you get a soul bond? And why Dichro? The Reaper asked her older sister in concern. Blake tried to field for this one but was interrupted by the door into the infirmary opening up, revealing the Schneeris and Team JNPR. The new visitors looked, for the most part, nonplussed as they each tried to gauge what was going on before John spoke first, asking, Did we come at a bad time? Ashvin shook his head as he eyed Team JNPR and the missing member of Team RWBY before replying, No, as a matter of fact, you're right on time. One of the medical staff should be coming out with the results of some blood work they did. Sure enough, a man with a white coat and beige shirt and pants came out of the door opposite to the one the new visitors came through. As the man approached, his expression was similar to that of Ashvin, save that it was more tiring, as if the man had been thinking too much, before holding up the clipboard he had in his arm. Mr. Spectrum will eventually make a full recovery, the doctor started to explain, but his tests, while actually typical for humans, are incredibly off for a faunus, especially one as rare a breed as he is. So he really is an ant faunus? Para asked in concern. The doctor nodded before continuing. His glucose levels are dangerously low as well as his cholesterol, he stated as he looked at the clipboard. His body has been malnourished, dehydrated, and running on empty for quite some time and needs to restore his fats and blood sugars soon. At hearing this, everyone except Ashvin stared at the doctor in shock. Yang, however, was the first to ask how they could do anything to help with that. To this, the doctor stated, as a doctor, what I'm about to suggest goes against everything medical science has ever stood for. But he needs to go on a high-fat, high-sugar diet. Make sure he gets as many proteins and eats as much fatty foods and sweets as he can. Even if he says he's full, make sure he finishes it. Why should we do that? Blake asked. We'll just be forcing him to get sick, won't we? The man smiled at Blake's observation before shaking his head and replying, actually not so. You see, ant faunus aren't like normal faunus in that they don't experience hunger like the rest of us. As he said rest of us, Blake took note of the not-so-hidden Labrador tail that was jutting out from between the coat's tails and thought, at least there's someone who won't be biased against him here. That being said, he'll need about 5 or 6 small meals a day just to get his metabolism kick-started back up. The doctor began again. I'd recommend a few servings of super fatty foods like bacon and, say, a 2-inch width slice of cake just to start off for an example. Oh, before I forget, Doc, Yang interjected as she asked, you mind me asking why he fainted like he did? The man simply nodded before answering. The stress of the shock, combined with the malnourishment of his body, is what caused his body to essentially shut down until it can recover, which will be soon. Thank you for your discretion, the headmaster said, but for now, we need you to disappear for the moment. Your patient here has iatrophobia, if I remember correctly, and would fall under duress if he spotted you. With this, the doctor nodded before leaving the room where he came, setting the clipboard on the desk next to what used to be Ruby's seat as he did so. Nora simply stared at their unconscious, impromptu leader for a second in a cross of pity and envy before speaking up. Aw. I want to have his diet plan. Nora. Ren started on her case, you already have too much energy as is, you're not even allowed to have caffeine. Yang, RWBY called out to her big sister, who answered with a yo. Before RWBY spoke up again, you never answered my questions. Yang looked at her sister in distress before she sighed heavily in guilt. He asked me to unlock his aura for him this morning. And, well, she began before Blake interrupted and answered for her. RWBY, your sister had no idea she had a soul bond with him until after she told me about it. And I then told Nora about it because she refused to leave me alone until I answered her. Long story short, it was a complete accident on both parts. That's why she can feel what he feels, and apparently it can work both ways. RWBY simply nodded, despite visibly not being okay with this, as she looked at her half-sib in concern. Yang, she started, please be careful next time you do this, okay? Nervously chuckling, Yang donned a lopsided grin as she scratched the back of her head before replying, don't you worry about that, Rubes. That was a one-time thing and I won't be doing that again. With that, she was glomped by her baby sister in a massive hug for someone her size was capable of. Run had his hand on his chin looking at Daikro's unconscious form before thinking aloud, that explains all that, but there's still one thing that's been bothering me, why did Daikro not know he was a faunus? That question got everyone but Ashbin's attention and got them to thinking about possible reasons why. They looked to said headmaster for an answer, only for him to shake his head in a negative as he said, that is for Daikro to disclose. Not me. Either way, Weiss said as she glared at the dichromatic boy, we're not leaving here without answers. And he has a lot of questions to answer. Both teams resumed their own musings on what was going on. Any further train of thoughts on the matter vanished as a soft groan cut through the short silence. Chapter 10, Getting Acquainted. First person dash. Numb. Tired. Drained. That's how I felt as I started to come to. I groaned as a piercing light hit my partially opened eyes. It was stinging so badly that I tried to cover my eyes with a hand, yet the light still came through. I tried to say someone turn off the light, yet my mouth fumbled on the words as I slowly regained consciousness. When my eyes finally got used to the light and the pain stopped, I noticed a few blurred figures off in the distance and a few less than blurry ones. What felt like a wave of relief washed over me, yet I was still too incoherent to recognize it. What I did recognize, though, was a ball of gold and light tan standing beside me. Yang? I called out, the ball nodding her head. I rubbed my eyes with the balls of both hands trying to clear the water and sleep from them before I tried to sit up, only to be sat up by the very person I had recognized off the bat. Confusion ran rampant through me as the last thing I remembered was being told that I was an ant faunus and that I was about to cut off a body part instead of hair. At first, I thought that was a dream. But then I found myself floating in darkness before I was swimming in a bowl of milk or cream or something as a green tiger with orange stripes was lapping it up, so I kinda knew when the actual dream started. That still left the two questions that were ringing through my head. Where am I? And what happened? As I asked this, I felt unease rush through me before looking up at Yang and then at my surroundings. My fear was starting to kick in as I recognized where I was, the infirmary. My breathing hastened in pace as I felt panic start to sink in, though at the time I thought it was mine. Almost immediately, a hand rested on my shoulder, but I tried to squirm out of it before arms wrapped around mine. It's alright, I heard Yang say. Somehow this was calming me down as she continued, no one is here to hurt you. You can relax. My breathing slowed down as I calmed down completely before looking to her and nodded. Thanks. Sorry about that. I apologized. After some time of just staying there in her arms, I figured she'd let go from being uncomfortable or uneasy as she is still surrounded by her peers, yet she still hadn't even after I had everything explained to me, about the soul bond I now shared with Yang by Blake, about what was going to happen with my eating habits by Ashbin, and having Nora and to some degree RWBY complain about it being unfair. I was so not looking forward to this. So let me get this right. I started off, I'm supposed to do the exact opposite of what I've known all my life, because I'm not a human? Essentially, yes, was Osmond's reply. I merely shook my head as I looked at Yang, who smiled nervously as she continued to hold me. Just as I was about to ask if she wanted to let go, Ren spoke up and asked, wait a moment. Do faunus exist where you're from? And if so, what entails physically being considered one? I was feeling very reluctant to answer that by saying faunus don't exist where I'm from simply because that would cause too wide of a panic, and that any other answer I could give would only bring about dissent against me by everyone except Ashbin. So I had to give an answer that would make it sound like I was just simply being ignorant. Where I come from, I began my exposition. A faunus is considered any person with mammalian traits such as cat ears, bull horns, etc. Everyone, except the Dumbledore of Remnant, stared at me in what I assumed was disbelief, especially since I could feel Yang's disbelief as she looked down at me wide-eyed. Blake, however, was the first one to actually voice her discontent at this as she said, how can people be so ignorant? Speaking of ignorant, I was trying to feign confusion as I looked to her with a raised eyebrow. Whatcha mean? Isn't that what normally consists of a faunus? I asked. I could feel something akin to distrust coming from Yon as Blake shook her head. That's only the most common faunus, she said. There are other different kinds from avians to reptilians and even insectoids like you. How is it your home's government can get away with that? I'll never know. I could feel the guilt of lying to everyone forming in me, but it was the only way I knew to keep them as in the dark as possible, though Yon would now be the hardest to keep all this a secret from because of our bond. I just hope she will understand why I have to do this, I thought to myself in remorse. Yang must have felt it as she tightened her hold on me slightly before speaking up. I think we need to drop this subject for another time. She let go slowly, and as I looked at her, she gave a small smirk as she held her nose. Besides, you need some cleaning up, missing clothes or not, she said as if trying to sound mean, but I could feel her joy at trying to be playful and smiled regardless. Yeah, something tells me I'm gonna have a bath time if I don't get washed up. I joked. Everyone, even Ashbin, groaned at this. Yang herself, however, was for a different reason. She wanted in on this action. Oh, why do you have to soap up all the fun? She asked, which prompted everyone but Ashbin and myself to groan again. I felt a bit of disappointment from both her and myself at this one and said, girl, that was bad, even for you. I know. She said before smiling again, I'd rather avoid bath jokes. That got me to laughing and almost falling off the bed if not for her arms catching me. Whoa, I think that one was too much, she stated as she set me on the floor. Chuckling, I nodded at her and made for the door to try and leave when Ashbin coughed a little trying to nab my attention, and it worked as I looked up at him. There is still the matter of discovering exactly what you are capable of, Mr. Spectrum, he said before he took a swig of that coffee of his before speaking up once more, both as Dichrospectrum and as Kamen Rider Paradox. Actually, I interrupted, it's only pronounced that but it's really spelled Pra-DX. And don't bother asking why. I didn't make the name up, I'm just following the rules. With that, Ashbin nodded solemnly and announced, after classes tomorrow, the amphitheater will be closed off to everyone except the 9 of you, Professor Goodwitch, and I. We will only be there to examine your fighting styles both as individuals and as teams. Everyone present nodded their agreement to the conditions, but one thing bothered me. Uno problema. I began, I don't have a makeshift weapon. Or a weapon at all except the GGD, for that matter. That can be rectified over the course of the weekend, the headmaster replied. I'll have one of the second-year teams aid you in your task if you feel it is necessary. Knowing what team he would most likely sick on me to do that, I reluctantly nodded. With that, he simply dismissed us to return to our dorms and left. The next day dash. While I didn't get to sleep on a bed last night, still had to sleep out in the hallway just to keep out of everyone's way much to RWBY's protests, I felt a lot better than I did before having my first bath in almost 5 days. The only downside? I had locked myself in the bathroom, towel wrapped around my waist, until someone went and cleaned my clothes as I held the GGD in my hand. I wasn't going to trust anyone to even touch it. When the time for classes actually came, the professors were kind enough to excuse me for my lack of uniform due to my, diminutive stature. Heaven knows they weren't really expecting someone who was as tall as a 12 or 13-year-old to be attending the school, despite me being 16. And before we dropped the topic of classes, the classes themselves were actually pretty standard in terms of effectiveness. And by that, I mean we simply had to listen to lectures for majority of the time, of which I nearly fell asleep during 4 of them. I felt pretty disappointed not only in the actual classes but in myself as well each time it happened, and each time it happened, Yang was right there at the end of class to give me a pat on the back to try and cheer me up before rushing off to her next class. I knew she was getting bored of them as well, though. I could feel her boredom just like it was my own. Ever since I had learned about the soul bond that Yang and I share, I started feeling a sort of self-doubt about whether this was a good thing or not. Effectively, if I die I'm taking her soul with me and leaving the body alive and behind, something I'm not too keen on. If she dies on me I deserve whatever I get, but I don't think I could handle even making my worst enemy go through that. Still, it has its benefits I guess. Like finding out where I need to go if I ever get lost. Which is quite literally around every corner. Lunch came and went. It was, eventful. Seeing everyone try to shove cake down my throat, however, wasn't the best course to take. The reason they had to hold me down, though, was plain and simple. I hate sweets. The only reason I ate those berries during my time in the Emerald Forest was because they were the only food source I had access to. If I had another choice, I would have avoided the berries and just stayed in the bush as a shelter. Back on track, if it wasn't for Ruby's suggestion of putting fire dust on everything I found too sweet, I'd have probably had every single sugary sweet melted from my gaze alone. I'll be honest, though, I didn't think it was actually safe to consume dust of any kind like that, but once I did I almost fell in love with it. Now I know how to fix up candies from now on. The rest of the day continued as I said until classes were finally over and the PA system asked for both teams RWBY and JNPR to the now emptied amphitheater. When we arrived, I noticed Ashvin and Glinda right off the bat in front of the door along with Professor Port standing next to the headmaster and a man with messy green hair and disheveled clothes wearing full moon glasses that I had no idea how he could see through them standing next to Goodwitch, Professor RWBY at his oddest, everyone. Good, everyone is here, Ashvin began before I interrupted by calling out, excuse me a moment. I pointed to RWBY and Port before asking, do they know about my you-know-what? Not yet, they don't. But I feel it will be necessary for them to study it as well due to their involvement as your professors, the headmaster explained. Though I didn't like it, I agreed with the logic of the situation. They would need to know eventually, just like Yang would need to know the truth. The professors motioned for all of us to enter the chamber and lock the doors behind us once we did. Ashvin quickly strode over and onto the stage before turning to the collective teams. For this first exhibition, he began, we will be pairing members of each team against members of the other team for 2-on-2 combat. With this, Mr. Spectrum will be able to discern who is capable of what before deciding his opponents for all three forms as well as helping him discern a potential leader for Team JNPR. Ms. Rose and Ms. Schnee will be sparring against Mr. Ark and Ms. Nikos, Ms. Valkyrie and Mr. Ren will be sparring against Ms. Xiao Long and Ms. Belladonna. Yeah, this won't end well, I interjected. When asked why that is by Professor Port, I simply replied, because when it comes to John's fighting skills, pitting him against Ruby and Weiss is like feeding a small child to a pack of rabid wolves. While I don't doubt that Pyrrha on her own could defeat both girls, it's her ability to protect John that I reserve my doubts for. Then what do you propose, Mr. Spectrum? Glinda asked. I put a finger to my chin and closed my eyes and thought before finally speaking. A 2-on-1 handicap. John will be allowed to take both girls on his own provided that they are barred from using their semblance at any given time. After all, like me, he doesn't even have a semblance yet, so his sparring partners would need to be equally fair. Though I doubt his opponents in the future will be as forgiving, he needs to be brought into this one step at a time. While those terms, under normal circumstances, are more than agreeable, Professor RWBY stated, I'm afraid that they will not be held to those conditions. Alright, but if he dies, you're planning the funeral and telling his parents, I replied shrugging my shoulders as the teams separated into their respective matches. With JP and RW-. Third person POV-. John and Pyrrha stood next to each other and across from Ruby and Weiss on the far left side of the stage. Both pairs of partners faced each other and nodded once before they drew their respective weapons, with John being the slowest and most reluctant as he unsheathed his sword and brought his shield up. So, any chance you girls would go easy on me? He asked in vain hope that they would be merciful to him. Ruby hummed as she brought a finger to her chin and looked up slightly as she pretended to think on it before turning to the blonde young man and smiling deviously and saying, "No." Slumping his shoulders in defeat, he sighed exaggeratedly as he got into a traditional knight stance with his shield raised and his sword held low before saying, "Oh well, it was worth a shot." The partners stared each other down before the Reaper girl vanished in a flurry of rose petals. The heiress simply glanced at where her partner used to be before doing a double take and stomping a foot on the floor of the stage in annoyance, shouting, "Ruby, you are insufferable." As she had her small tantrum, to which John and Pyrrha both stared at her flabbergasted, a red blur zipped behind the Spartan huntress and struck her in the back before moving to John in the same manner. This knocked both of them forward, with Pyrrha recovering with a roll and her partner simply trying to stand upright again. "Oh, my back!" The poor boy groaned before noticing a glowing white diagram appearing beneath himself and Pyrrha. He quickly bolted to the girl and shoved her out of the way to stop her from getting caught in an explosion of ice. "Keep an eye on the ground," he warned her. "If you see one of those, consider it lava." Not quite getting the reference, the Spartan merely nodded before standing upright with her back against her partner's. The red blur from earlier was now striking at every vantage point it could find, from the top of their heads to the backs of their hands, only to be blocked by either a shield or a sword. Using an impact shot to increase her altitude, Ruby called out to her partner, "Weiss, split 'em up." "Don't need to tell me twice," the heiress replied before summoning another glyph underneath both of their opponents, but this one being twice as large as the one before it. Both of them noticed this and tried to move out of the way, but only the invincible girl escaped it. The blonde knight, however, got caught in the explosion with formed jagged edges of ice all around his legs, right forearm and left bicep, effectively trapping him in the pseudo-sculpture. "Gah! Geez, I'm stuck!" John cried out in panic as he struggled to free himself to no avail, only to notice his partner was now trying to survive a flurry of red strikes to her back as she and the heiress were now fighting head-to-head, rapier clashing with sword as Pyrrha used her momentum to leap over Weiss when she anticipated Ruby's attack. He had to help her somehow, but all he could do in his current predicament was sit there and watch. "Unless I do something," he thought to himself, "Pyrrha's done for." "Come on, John, think." That's when the idea struck him. He had to give her his sword in order to help her stand a chance. John tried to focus all of his strength into freeing his right arm and was rewarded with the shattering of the ice surrounding it. "Pyrrha!" he called out before flinging his sword at her with the intent of letting her use it. Instead, it spun straight at the girl, who ducked under it in time to see it hack off a good half of her ponytail and then slam hilt first into Ruby's forehead with a loud and metallic thunk, knocking her over before slapping Weiss on top of her head with the flat of the blade and clattering on the floor. This was the distraction Pyrrha needed as she slammed her shield into the heiress before turning to her trapped partner. He simply shrugged his free arm as he said, "Sorry about that, was meaning to give you my sword, not a haircut." She simply smiled at him before taking aim with Milo as she cocked the weapon back, changed it into its javelin form, and warned him, "Stay still, John, I'll have you out of there." She threw the javelin forward as its rocket-propelled trajectory nailed the ice at the center and shattered the entire structure, freeing him as he fell to the ground with a yelp. As this was going on, a certain dichromatic boy couldn't help but slap his face and smear his hand down it in frustration that he just unintentionally and indirectly made yet another change in this world's history due to him being a judge. Meanwhile, with WB and NR Blake simply drew Gamble's shroud out of its sheath before turning it into its pistol form before eyeing her opponents up cautiously, with Rin doing similar as he drew his twin weapons from their holsters on his belt. Yang, however, was busy conversing with Nora as she activated her gauntlets. "So who do you think's gonna win?" she asked the pink-loving hammer thrower, who simply shrugged in response. "Well then," the blonde brawler started to taunt, "this is gonna be a piece of cake." "You mean a piece of pancake?" Nora asked, giggling at her own joke. "Meh, I'm more of a waffle person," Yang replied nonchalantly. This made Nora freeze up in wide-eyed shock, and her partner looked between the two out of visible fear. The girl's shock was replaced with anger with each word she spoke as she asked, "What did you say?" Oh," were the only words Yang could get out of her mouth before she had to duck a close shave from Manghild, her sudden fear of the girl overriding the anger at having lost a few locks of hair just now as she made a quick dash to get away from the girl using her gauntlets to further push her momentum. Get back here, you dirty waffle lover! Nora cried out as she ran after the taller girl. The perplexed Cat Faunus simply looked on in confusion as she tried to make sense of the situation before Ring called out to her. Blake, I need your help. He quickly pleaded to her. When Nora gets like this, she tends to lose herself, so I need you to find a way to restrain her while I snap her out of it. She only nodded as she ran after the carrot-topped girl who kept swinging at and missing, Yang who kept running and dodging her attacks, trying to calm the girl down and failing. When she got close enough, Black threw her weapon around one of Nora's ankles and pulled as hard as she could, causing the girl to slip and faceplant into the stage floor, and Ren to catch up to her, before pulling a smallish jar out of his pocket. The jar itself had something folded inside of it with a label on it that read, "In case of angry Nora, open lid." He opened the lid and pulled out the contents, which unfolded into a whole pancake, and held it up to the girl, who sniffed it before sitting up and nabbing it from her friend. After giving it one final look, Nora finally gobbled down the fluffy round disc of sweetness with a brilliant smile on her face as Rin sighed in relief. Yang looked at the two and nervously smiled before saying, "Well, that was a thing. How about we just call it a draw and forget this ever happened?" Nora looked up at Yang after finishing her pancake and cocked her head to the side as she asked, "Forget whatever happened?" "Exactly," the blonde brawler replied before suddenly feeling a wave of frustration washing over her, and looked at the cause of it to see Daikro in the middle of a facepalm. She looked in the direction her bondmate was looking at the time and found out why he suddenly felt annoyed. If she had to guess, John must have given Pyrrha an accidental haircut, judging from her now shorter than half ponytail. First person POV dash. I couldn't take it. I had to stop the match before things got even worse. I looked over to the professors and asked, "Can we end this? I picked out my opponents?" Ojban simply nodded and looked to be ready to speak before I cupped my hands to either side of my mouth and shouted as loud as my lungs could carry my voice. "Alright, that's enough." That broke the combatants up as RWBY tripped with Pyrrha and Weiss flinching and John jumping in shock before he tried to clean his ear out. "Smooth move, idiot," I scolded myself before drawing everyone's attention to me and saying, "I picked out not only my opponents, but who will potentially be the leader for Team JNPR, and that leader is John Ark." They all looked shocked and were clearly about to congratulate him, but I held up my hand in a stopping motion. Please note, however, that I chose him by the skin of his damn teeth. I shouted out before continuing, "When it comes to quick thinking and strategy making, his skills are bar none one of the best I've seen, but his skills as a fighter on his own are non-existent even by beginner's standards. As for my opponents, I have chosen Weishni to fight my human form." "Sorry, Faunus form, still trying to get used to being called that," said Eris, simply harumphed as she crossed her arms. I think she was disappointed that she doesn't get to fight one of my Para-DX forms, but I can't quite tell. "Pyrrha Nikos to fight my Puzzle Gamer form." Pyrrha simply nodded before Port butted in and asked, "Puzzle Gamer form? What does he mean?" Ojban simply laid his concerns aside as he said, "You will find out soon enough, Peter." I nodded before I resumed calling out my opponents. "And my final opponent will be Yang Xiaolong against my Fighter Gamer form," I announced, and felt a sense of pride coming from Yang and looked over to her to catch her at the end of a fist pump. That got me to chuckling a little before I turned back to John. "To start off, however, I will need to borrow a weapon as I don't have one myself," I said as I walked up to the Ditzy Knight before asking, "May I borrow yours, John, and show you just how you can really use it to your advantage?" He simply nodded as he handed me Crochamores and left the stage with the others in tow, except for Weiss, who simply looked on at them leaving the stage before staring me down. "You do realize you just signed your own death warrant, right?" she asked me in an icy tone as she got into her traditional fencing stance. I simply shrugged as I adjusted the shield so that the bottom was pointed in the direction my fist was before replying, "Hey, at least you're not going against Para-DX, so that's a win." I banged the flat of the blade against the shield a couple of times in a taunt before I held the shield up in a blocking position with the sword resting on top of it and pointing downward slightly. The heiress fell for it as she used her glyphs to dash straight at me. Feigning an attack, she quickly changed directions to try and strike at my upper back, but I adjusted the shield enough to pass it over my head and rested on my shoulder before I felt the telltale pressure of the impact from her weapon hitting the shield. As if she were changing tactics, I saw her move around to my front and try to make a thrust with her rapier, but simply stepped back as I pushed the sword against her blade to further alter her momentum before landing a solid blow to her head as I used the shield as a giant boxing glove, though arguably I may have put too much force into the punch as she was sent careening through the back wall of the amphitheater. Stupid ant strength. I whispered and chided myself before shouting out, "My bad." Third person POV dash. My word! Professor Port exclaimed as he looked on in shock, as did most of the students and staff present. The only one not surprised by this was Ajpan as he sipped his fresh mug of coffee. That would be the legendary ant fauna strength that Daikro just demonstrated, the headmaster said when he finished his drink. The students, however, were more concerned for what may or may not have happened to Weiss. "Did you see that?" Yang exclaimed as she punched the air. "He sent that ice queen flying." John cringed a little as he turned to the blonde brawler and spoke his own concerns. "Yeah. Straight through a wall." Para added in her own 2 bits by saying, "That's at least 4 feet thick and made of concrete." "Using your shield, John. I just hope Weiss is okay," Ruby said in concern. Yang noticed this and felt a pang of worry from her bondmate before seeing him rushing to the debris. "She'll be fine," she assured her baby half-sister. "Look, Daikro's even checking on Okamon. Be serious." "What happened?" Blake asked. Yang turned to her in slight annoyance before answering, "I think Miss Cold Shoulder just got lightheaded from the impact." I could feel Daikro trying to hold back his laughter just now. "At least we know she's okay now. Right?" Blake once more spoke and got a nod in return from her partner. Daikro came down carrying the unconscious heiress over his shoulders and set her down on one of the chairs before turning to the professors. "I guess there goes my faunus demonstration," he said as he shrugged his shoulders before lifting his jacket up a little and pulling out the familiar yellow not blue device and asking, "Now then, which one you wanna see first?" To be continued.